Hey guys, tonight we dive straight into a story where just hearing the name of its main character already feels like a whole sky of tragedy descending King Henry VIII. A king who began his life with every ounce of power in his hands, yet eventually became consumed to the point of losing all reason by one single obsession: to secure a male heir at any cost. That obsession drove him to tear apart the church, burn centuries of tradition, and push two women into tragedies from which there was no escape. Tonight, we follow Henry's footsteps during the darkest stretch of his life, when his marriage of more than 20 years to Catherine of Aragon could no longer defy fate, when Anne Boleyn stepped into his world with a glow that was both enchanting and dangerous, and when every choice Henry made began turning into a whirlwind that would sweep across England and reshape it forever. But don't worry, this isn't a lecture, and it isn't a historical debate. Tonight, you only need to lie down, loosen your thoughts, and let me recount everything at a slow, steady, dream-soft rhythm, like the echoes drifting through the stone halls of a Tudor palace. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And before we begin this long journey, where are you watching from? What time is it where you live? Leave a comment so we can see which corners of the world our little community is awake or already sleepy in tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Henry VIII was born on the 28th day of June, in the year 1491, at Greenwich Palace just outside London, and in the soft, dim glow of history, he often appears almost larger than life. But in the beginning, he was simply a second son, never meant to rule, never meant to bear the weight of a kingdom born to King Henry VII, the first monarch of the Tudor line, and Elizabeth of York, daughter of King Edward IV. Their marriage, forged in the aftermath of the Wars of the Roses, was more than a union of two people. It was the quiet stitching together of two houses, Lancaster and York, that had spilled rivers of blood across England for decades. From that long-awaited peace came 7 children, though only a few would survive long enough to leave marks upon the world. Before Henry arrived, Arthur and Margaret were born. Afterward came 3 daughters and another son, but only Mary, born in 1496, lived beyond childhood. Elizabeth, Edmund, and Catherine faded early, as so many Tudor children did. And so Henry entered life not as the shining heir to the English throne, but as the spare. His brother Arthur, Prince of Wales, carried the weight of destiny. His path was mapped, his future crowned. Henry's path, by contrast, seemed open, unshaped. A life meant for learning, for ceremony, for comfort, not for kingship. At Eltham Palace, he was surrounded by tutors who guided him through grammar, rhetoric, history, philosophy, logic, arithmetic, and languages. French, Spanish, Italian, Latin, Greek. Even as a boy, he showed a startling quickness, a mind that caught and held ideas easily, a body lithe and active, capable of both thoughtful learning and athletic grace. It is hard to reconcile that young boy, nimble, elegant, musical, with the swollen, suffering king he would later become, crushed beneath the agony of a festering leg wound. John Skelton, the poet who later earned the title Poet Laureate, taught Henry moral instruction, embedding in him a sincere Roman Catholic devotion that would stay with him, even as his life eventually tore England away from Rome. His mother, Elizabeth of York, taught him how to write, and their handwriting so similar that scholars can hardly tell them apart remains one of the tender shards of evidence that, before he became a figure of fear and legend, Henry was simply a child loved deeply by his family. Even though he was not the heir, Henry accumulated titles with astonishing speed, gifts from a father who expected discipline and obedience. Duke of York, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Earl Marshal of England, Warden of the Scottish Marches. The boy carried these heavy, glittering names long before he carried a crown. Yet, in the quiet corners of domestic life, he grew up surrounded almost entirely by women. His mother, his sisters, his paternal grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, each of whom adored him, coddled him, wrapped him in their affections. Many historians believe that this early orbit of loving women shaped him profoundly. It nurtured in him a yearning for romance, admiration, and loyalty, but also a sharp petulance, a hot, almost childlike anger when he was denied what he wanted. And so, in the soft haze of his childhood, Henry was charming, bright, talented, loved yet seeded with all the contradictions that would later bloom into storms. Tenderness and vanity, devotion and impulsiveness, longing and fury. He was not born a tyrant, nor a monster, nor a legend, only a second son, moving gently beneath the warm hands of his family, unaware that fate, illness, and death would soon thrust the entire kingdom upon his shoulders and begin reshaping him into the king history would never forget. On the 2nd day of April, in the year 1502, Arthur Henry's older brother and the official heir to the English throne died, likely from tuberculosis or the mysterious sweating sickness that had swept through England in sudden, terrifying waves. His death was quiet, but the echo it cast across Henry's life would never fade. In that single moment, the axis of Henry's world shifted forever. The Tudor dynasty, still young and fragile, had already been stitched together from uncertainty and uneasy claims, and Arthur's passing placed the entire weight of its future onto the narrow shoulders of a 10-year-old boy. The Tudor bloodline itself was woven from threads that many nobles viewed with suspicion. Henry VII had seized the throne in the year 1485, after defeating King Richard III, a ruler of the House of York, whose legitimacy had been stained by the disappearance and probable murder of his 2 young nephews in the Tower of London. The Tudors traced their ancestry to King Edward III, but through the line of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford, whose children had originally been born out of wedlock. Even though they were later legitimised, whispers of illegitimacy clung to the Tudor name like a faint, unwelcome shadow. Added to this was their Welsh origin, a detail that did not sit comfortably with certain English nobles, who still clung to old hierarchies and older prejudices. Because of this fragile political foundation, Henry VII lived with a constant dread, a sense that a new challenger might rise at any moment to threaten what he had fought so hard to win. Arthur had been his anchor, the secure future of the dynasty. But with Arthur gone, suddenly it was Henry II's son, the boy who had never been prepared for rule, who became the hope of the realm. The fear of needing a clear, indisputable male heir, a smooth succession, a line that could not be questioned. This fear settled across the life of the young prince like a shadow that would lengthen with time. After Arthur's death, Henry VII took direct control of his surviving son's upbringing. He named Henry the new Prince of Wales, lifting him suddenly out of the comfortable life of a cherished spare and placing him directly into the rigid expectations of kingship. The shift was abrupt, jarring, and heavy. What had once been a childhood of music, lessons, and affectionate indulgence transformed into a training ground for survival. The relationship between father and son hardened almost immediately. Henry VII, cautious, severe, shaped by years of war and uncertainty, believed deeply in restraint and vigilance. He forbade Henry from taking part in dangerous sports such as jousting, fearing that a single accident could snatch away the only remaining heir to the Tudor throne. But Henry, young and proud, burned with embarrassment. His friends rode in tournaments, proved their strength in public, displayed the courage expected of noble young men, while he was restricted to safe, wooden practice lances and mock exercises. It was a small humiliation, but humiliation sinks deep into the heart of a boy destined to be king. Over time, the distance between father and son widened. Henry VII, though diligent and prudent, became increasingly despised among the people for his harsh financial policies and the secretive circle of advisors who enforced them. Meanwhile, Prince Henry grew steadily more popular. Tall, handsome, confident, he radiated the youthful promise of a king who might bring lighter days after years of strict rule. Even in childhood, his charm was a force that gathered admiration around him like warmth around a flame. Whatever tensions existed between father and son, one truth remains clear. Henry VII left his heir an invaluable inheritance. Through all his frugality and suspicion, he built a stable treasury, filled with surplus funds and careful accounting. It was a foundation strong enough to support England for years to come. And it was a fortune his son, King Henry VIII, would one day spend lavishly, joyfully, and spectacularly, as if he were trying to burn away every shadow his father had ever left behind. One of the greatest complications following Arthur's death was the unresolved matter of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile, the royal pair whose union had bound much of Spain into a single, formidable kingdom. Arthur and Catherine had been wed in the year 1501, a carefully arranged bond meant to secure a strong alliance between England and Spain. But Arthur died before the marriage could mature into the political cornerstone both kingdoms expected it to be. Henry VII, ever cautious and ever driven by the need to secure the Tudor line, quickly began negotiations to have Catherine marry his remaining son, young Henry. But nothing about this arrangement was simple. The talks stretched across years, weighed down by financial disputes concerning Catherine's dowry, and by a far more delicate question whether Arthur and Catherine had truly consummated their marriage. Under canon law, if they had lived as husband and wife, Henry could not lawfully marry her. Every letter, every witness statement, every whispered recollection was scrutinized, yet no definitive answer emerged. And so, like a knot pulled tight by time, the issue remained unresolved. Matters stood in this uneasy state until the 21st day of April in the year 1509, when Henry VII died. In that quiet, irreversible moment, everything changed. His 17-year-old son, handsome, tall, athletic, bright, charming, was instantly proclaimed King Henry VIII. Across England, a wave of hope swept through the nobility, the gentry, even the common folk. Gone was the old king, with his strict economy and anxious vigilance. In his place stood a new monarch, who seemed to embody youth, promise, and golden possibility. Many believed the dawn of a new age, one more generous, one more joyous, had arrived. Barely 3 weeks after his father's death, on the 11th day of June, in the year 1509, the young king married Catherine in a private ceremony. A papal dispensation had been granted, allowing them to bypass the barrier of canon law. The union, at last, was made legitimate not only through diplomacy, but through the authority of the Church itself. Catherine, 6 years older than Henry, became queen, cloaked in both expectation and relief. 2 weeks later, on the 24th day of June, the newly crowned king and queen walked the processional route to Westminster Abbey for their joint coronation. The path from Westminster Palace to the Abbey shimmered with cloth of gold, embroidered tapestries, and rich draperies fluttering softly in the summer air. Henry wore a robe of red velvet trimmed with fur, and a garment adorned with jewels that caught the light like scattered stars. Catherine, radiant in a mantle of precious fabric, wore a golden circlet set with pearls upon her head, her long auburn hair flowing loose as tradition commanded for a young queen. Inside the abbey, Archbishop William Warham anointed both Henry and Catherine with holy oil and placed crowns upon their heads amid the cries of "Vivat Rex," long live the king. It was a spectacle of splendor and harmony, the last time in nearly 2 centuries that England would witness a joint coronation of king and queen. The air was thick with expectation, with the sense that something bright and magnificent had begun. After the solemnity came celebration, 2 days of feasting, tournaments, and displays of martial skill. Henry, finally free from his father's restrictions, rode boldly in the tilt-yard, the very sport he had long yearned for while still a prince. The court, fashioned after the image of medieval warrior kings, revelled in music, dancing, brilliant fabrics, and extravagant meals of 7 courses each night. In those early years, the royal household glowed with abundance, with laughter, with the carefree rhythm of a reign not yet troubled by shadows. And soon there was hopeful news. Catherine became pregnant early in their marriage. It seemed, for a brief and gentle moment, that the future Henry longed for, the secure dynastic line his father had obsessed over, might unfold just as beautifully as the coronation tapestries that had welcomed him to the throne. Catherine's long struggle to give England an heir began under a cloud of sorrow. In the final days of January, in the year 1510, she suffered a miscarriage, a baby girl lost before she could take her first breath. 1 year later, in January of the year 1511, Catherine delivered a son, Prince Henry. Bells rang across London, bonfires burned through the night, and the court celebrated what seemed to be the long-awaited securing of the Tudor line. Yet the joy was heartbreakingly brief. The infant prince survived only 7 weeks, his cause of death never clearly recorded, slipping away before England could even learn the sound of his cries. More losses followed. In the autumn of the year 1513, and again in the early winter of 1514, Catherine delivered 2 more sons, both either stillborn or living for only hours, perhaps days. Records blur around these tiny lives, but the outcome was tragically certain. no child survived. It would be easy, knowing Henry VIII's later reputation as a merciless ruler, to imagine that he immediately blamed Catherine for these failures. But the truth of these early years tells a gentler story. For a long time, their marriage remained warm, steady, and united in the face of grief. Henry showed patience, real patience, and a tenderness that history sometimes forgets. In the England of the 16th century, miscarriage, infant mortality, and stillbirth were painfully common, even among the nobility. A noble or royal wife might become pregnant 10 or 12 times, because only a handful of those children could realistically be expected to survive into adulthood. Catherine's ability to conceive easily was actually viewed as a promising sign. All they needed, people believed, was time. Sooner or later, a healthy son might come. While they waited for fate to turn in their favour, Henry and Catherine governed England together with notable harmony. Henry began his reign by easing the burdens left by his father. He forgave debts, made peace with rival factions who had suffered under Henry VII, and earned public affection for his generosity and charisma. Catherine, too, became beloved, admired for her intelligence, her deep piety, her dignity, and her unwavering commitment to the English people. That trust reached its clearest expression in the summer of the year 1513, when Henry prepared to wage war in France. Aligning himself with Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry sought to revive the old glories of conquest, reminiscent of King Henry V, the victor of Agincourt. Across Europe, conflict was spreading through the Italian wars. In Italy, Pope Julius II struggled against King Louis XII of France over territories belonging to the papacy. Hoping to secure England's support, Julius sent Henry gifts, barrels of Italian wine, a rose covered in gold, and rich wheels of Parmesan cheese tokens meant to entice a young monarch eager for glory. At home, Archbishop William Warham had preached sermons warning of the dangers of war, urging peace over ambition. But Henry, whose youth and pride still burned bright, chose the path of steel. And as he crossed the Channel to fight on French soil, Catherine was given a role no English queen had held in generations. She became regent in the king's absence. The appointment was not symbolic. It was power. Catherine presided over council meetings, issued directives, supervised the defence of the realm, and prepared for the possibility that France's old ally, Scotland, might attack while Henry was away. And when that moment came, she met it with a courage that impressed even the sternest soldiers. For as Henry chased dreams of martial triumph across the fields of France, Catherine would soon have her own battlefield on English soil, a stage on which she would show not only her loyalty, but her ability to command armies, rally men, and defend the kingdom in its king's name. In the shadow of such turmoil, the struggle for an heir faded briefly, eclipsed by the clash of nations, the thunder of hooves, and the quiet, steady resolve of a queen determined to protect England while her husband fought far from home. As Henry crossed the English Channel in the year 1513, winning first at Terouanne and then at the Battle of the Spurs, so named because the French knights fled with such haste that only the glint of their spurs could be seen, events in the north unfurled with dangerous urgency. Scotland, the ancient ally of France, saw England's king absent and seized the opportunity. King James IV marched south with an army of approximately 40,000 men, a force large enough to threaten the balance of the entire island. Catherine, serving as regent, did not remain a passive symbol of authority. She took an active role in mustering troops, coordinating logistics, and shaping the strategies that would determine England's survival. Under the command of Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, the English forces, roughly 26,000 strong, moved to intercept the invading Scots. The English longbowmen, heirs to the legacy of Crécy and Agincourt, formed the backbone of the army as they had for generations. On the 9th day of September, in the year 1513, the two armies clashed at the Battle of Flodden. The Scottish casualties were staggering. Nearly 17,000 Scots fell, among them King James IV himself, the last reigning monarch in Britain to die on a battlefield. England's losses were far smaller, approximately 1,500 men. It was a resounding, almost unbelievable victory. Catherine wrote to Henry with pride, informing him of the triumph and sending a scrap of the Scottish king's coat as a token for him to raise upon his banner. Meanwhile, English forces abroad continued their operations in Flanders and at Tournai, securing further, if temporary, gains. For a moment, England stood victorious on two fronts, and both victories bore Catherine's steady imprint as much as Henry's. 3 years later, after 7 long years of hoping and mourning, Catherine finally gave birth to a surviving child. On the 18th day of February, in the year 1516, Princess Mary, later Queen Mary I, came into the world. It was a moment of deep relief, celebration, and renewed expectation. Church bells rang, England rejoiced. Mary was healthy, resilient, and bright-eyed signs that perhaps a brother might follow in due time. Yet, even in this joy, there lingered an unspoken truth. No woman had ever reigned over England in her own right, and although English law did not enforce the strict Salic prohibition found in France, the idea of a female monarch remained unprecedented. Mary's birth was both a blessing and a reminder. Henry still lacked the perfect heir, the male successor who could silence every whisper of instability and every memory of the Wars of the Roses. Henry adored his daughter, calling her "my pearl in the world." He sent her to Ludlow Castle, where she presided over her own miniature court, just as tradition dictated for the Prince of Wales. It was an unmistakable sign of affection and pride. But beneath that affection, deep shadows stirred. Henry's longing for a son, fueled by fear, by dynastic anxiety, by the weight of his father's caution, never loosened its grip. By the early years of the 16th century's third decade, Catherine's age became an undeniable factor. She passed 40 in December of the year 1525. Each passing year made the hope of a healthy male child dimmer. And Henry, still youthful, still powerful, still determined to secure his dynasty, began taking mistresses with increasing regularity, an ordinary practice among European monarchs, though one heavy with implications in this particular marriage. In June of the year 1519, Elizabeth Blount, a young lady in waiting, gave birth to Henry's son. The boy was named Henry Fitzroy Henry for his father, and Fitzroy meaning son of the king. Henry acknowledged the child openly, granting him titles and affection, but under English law, Fitzroy remained illegitimate and thus barred from the line of succession. Still, this birth revealed something Henry could not ignore. He could father a healthy son. And in the quiet, dangerous chambers of Henry's mind, a thought began to take root. If the king could produce a boy, yet the queen could not deliver one who lived, then perhaps, just perhaps, the fault lay not with him, but with Catherine. It was a subtle shift at first, hardly noticeable against the noise of treaties, wars, feasts, and courtly life. But it was the start of a deep, relentless unravelling. This was the moment when Henry's longing evolved into obsession, when private doubt became public crisis, and when the life of a devoted queen and the future of an entire kingdom began moving, slowly and quietly, toward a storm that would change England forever. Despite the private turmoil in his household, the first decade of Henry VIII's reign glowed with ambition and brilliance. These were the years in which he sought to lift England onto the same stage as France and Spain, not merely as a participant, but as an equal, a kingdom of steel, ships, and sophistication. To that end, Henry invested heavily in the navy, pouring money into shipyards, warehouses, and coastal ports. Timber was harvested in vast quantities from the forests of Sussex and Kent, feeding the docks, where new warships rose from wooden ribs to full, formidable hulls. His father, Henry VII, had already planted the earliest seeds of England's maritime aspirations during the dawn of the Age of Exploration. It was under Henry VII's patronage that John Cabot sailed westward and touched the shores of North America in the year 1497, an achievement often overshadowed by Columbus's island ventures in the Caribbean, yet historically monumental. Henry VIII seized this legacy eagerly. By the early 1540s, the modest fleet of his youth had evolved into a naval force of approximately 50 ships, the early foundation of the navy that would one day dominate the seas under his daughter Elizabeth. Yet Henry understood that power in Europe required more than ships and swords. It required diplomacy, spectacle, and alliances woven with golden thread. In the year 1518, as the looming threat of the Ottoman Empire pushed into southeastern Europe, Henry joined a non-aggression pact with Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew and King Francis I of France. It was a fragile peace, but one wrapped in splendid ceremony. This pact opened the door to a series of resplendent diplomatic gatherings orchestrated by Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Henry's chief minister and the architect of much of England's foreign policy. The grandest of these was the famous Field of Cloth of Gold, in the year 1520, held near Calais. The very landscape was transformed for the occasion. Vast tents covered in shimmering cloth of gold, towering pavilions embroidered with silver thread, fountains flowing with wine, banquets overflowing with roasted meats, sugar sculptures, and sweet wines. Jousting tournaments lit the fields with the clash of lances, while music drifted over the encampment like warm summer air. At the height of the pageantry, Henry and Francis pledged eternal friendship. Princess Mary was betrothed to the French Dauphin, sealing the vision of a peaceful future with the intertwined hands of two royal children. It was a golden dream, brilliant, hopeful, and entirely crafted for show. But the glow of gold fades quickly when politics sharpen. Behind the curtain of celebration lay the cold arithmetic of real power. Only a short time after the Field of Cloth of Gold, Wolsey pivoted England into an alliance with Charles V, pulling Henry back into the Italian wars, this time against France. The vows of friendship sworn in those glittering tents dissolved like mist. At the same time, another transformation was quietly unfolding within Henry himself. Alongside his quest for martial prestige and diplomatic authority, he began carving out the image of a learned king, a scholar as well as a sovereign. Since the year 1517, Martin Luther had ignited the Protestant Reformation in Germany, challenging the authority of the Pope, criticizing the immense wealth of the Church, and calling for a purification of Christian practice. His writings spread quickly, unsettling the foundations of Catholic Europe. Henry, a devout Catholic from childhood, was deeply tied to the traditions of Rome. He loved the pageantry of Mass, the weight of ritual, the solemn beauty of icons and relics. Luther's attacks struck him personally, almost as an affront to his identity and convictions. And so, in the year 1521, Henry published a treatise titled Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, the Defense of the Seven Sacraments. The work directly refuted Luther, upholding the doctrines of the Roman Church and affirming the Pope's supreme authority over matters of faith. For this defense, Pope Leo X rewarded Henry with a distinguished title, Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith. It was an honor Henry treasured, one that still appears on British coins centuries later. Though it is likely that Thomas More assisted in the writing, the image of Henry at this time remains vivid. A young king who excelled in war, dazzled in diplomacy, immersed himself in scholarship, and held firm to the Catholic faith. In these early years, he stood at the height of youthful promise, beloved by his people, admired across Europe, and entirely unaware that the very faith he defended so passionately would soon become the battlefield on which he would tear England apart. By the mid-1520s, the colours of Henry's reign began to shift slowly at first, then with a gathering momentum that neither he nor England could escape. Catherine of Aragon had entered her 40s, and with each passing year, the likelihood of her bearing another healthy son ebbed away. Henry, meanwhile, already had one surviving boy, Henry Fitzroy, born in the year 1519. Though illegitimate, Fitzroy's existence whispered an idea that Henry clung to with increasing force, that the problem of succession did not lie with him. It was in this fragile, vulnerable moment that Anne Boleyn entered the stage. Anne, daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a diplomat who had served as ambassador to France, had recently returned from the sophisticated, glittering courts of the French monarchy. She carried with her the ease and elegance of that world, a sharp mind, quick wit, stylish manners, and a cosmopolitan grace that made her stand out immediately in the comparatively conservative English court. Born likely around the year 1501, she was in her early to mid-20s when Henry first noticed her young, enigmatic, and entirely unlike the women he had known. No one, at first, believed she could change the course of history. Anne understood her position clearly. Unlike her sister Mary Boleyn, who had once been Henry's mistress, Anne refused to become merely another passing affection of the king. Whether out of personal conviction, caution for her future, or sheer instinct for survival, she declared that her body was reserved only for her future husband. This boundary, delicate, immovable, and utterly unexpected, ignited Henry's desire. He was a king accustomed to admiration, to obedience, to effortless affection. Anne's refusal was the first door ever closed to him. The letters Henry later sent to her, some still preserved, reveal a side of the king history rarely remembers. Ardent, pleading, romantic, even vulnerable. He wrote of longing, loneliness, hope, and devotion. These were not the words of a tyrant, but of a man deeply and sincerely captivated. Later storytellers would paint Anne as an ambitious schemer, a woman who reached greedily for the crown. But the evidence tells a different story. Early in their acquaintance, Anne abruptly left court, withdrawing to her family's estate at Hever Castle. Her departure suggests hesitation, not ambition. It seems implausible that a young gentlewoman from a respectable but not dominant family imagined herself becoming Queen of England. The throne had never before been taken up by a woman beside the king through divorce, and certainly never through the downfall of a reigning queen. If Anne had ambitions, they were likely far simpler. Safety, security, perhaps a good marriage. No one in England, not even Henry, could yet imagine the whirlwind about to unfold. But Henry did not release her. He continued writing, sending gifts, expressing longing. Eventually Anne returned to court, and their relationship, once discreet, grew unmistakably public. For nearly 7 years, she remained unmarried and crucially unpregnant, reinforcing her claim that she kept her vow of chastity until marriage. The king visited her, spoke with her, dined near her, but she held that final line firmly. It was around the year 1527, after years of infatuation and rising fear about the succession, that Henry began to contemplate the unthinkable, ending his 20-year marriage to Catherine. His desire for Anne was a spark, but his desperation for a male heir was the fire. Henry and his advisers reached into the past and resurrected an old concern. Had Henry sinned by marrying his brother's widow? Catherine and Arthur had been married for only a few months before Arthur died, and Catherine swore repeatedly that the marriage had never been consummated. 18 years earlier, the Pope had granted a dispensation, allowing Henry to marry her anyway, settling the matter. But now Henry's mind circled back to the Old Testament. From the book of Leviticus, he drew a single sentence. "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless." For nearly 2 decades, Henry had ignored these words. Now he claimed they pierced his conscience. How could it be, he asked, that God had denied him a surviving son? Was this divine punishment for a marriage that should never have been? Could the papal dispensation be overruled by Scripture itself? And if so, was his union with Catherine not only invalid, but sinful? The question, once whispered, grew louder. It spread into council chambers, into theological debates, into the very heart of Henry's identity as defender of the faith. Anne Boleyn had not sought a crown. Henry's obsession with her, with a son, with the weight of dynasty, was the real force that began to shake England. And what started as a private dilemma would soon swell into a political and religious earthquake strong enough to crack Europe in two and tear England from Rome forever. Henry's great matter, his attempt to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, did not unfold quickly. It stretched out over more than half a decade, growing heavier and more tangled until it drew the whole of England into its orbit. At first, Henry pursued the legal and traditional route. He petitioned the Pope for an annulment. But the timing could not have been worse. Catherine's nephew was none other than Emperor Charles V, who, in the year 1527, had sent his soldiers to sack Rome and left Pope Clement VII, nearly a prisoner in his own ruined city. In such circumstances, it was unthinkable that Clement would grant an annulment that would publicly humiliate the emperor's aunt. The papacy had no room to maneuver. Henry's hopes then rested on Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the butcher's son who, thanks entirely to Henry's patronage, had risen to become Archbishop, Papal Legate, Lord Chancellor, and the most powerful political figure in England after the King himself. Wolsey created a legatine court within England, alongside Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio, to examine the marriage. It was an unprecedented attempt to solve the matter without appealing to Rome, but the court hesitated, it stalled, and in the end, it decided to refer the question back to Rome, where political pressure from Charles V would smother it completely. Henry's patience began to unravel. Historians have long debated whether Wolsey truly intended to help Henry win the annulment, or whether he sensed the danger in allowing a devout Catholic monarch to cast aside a devout Catholic queen in order to marry a woman rumoured, perhaps unfairly, to sympathise with Lutheran ideas. Whatever his true motives, Wolsey failed. And failure, in Henry's England, was fatal. Henry accused him of treason. Guards arrived to arrest him. Wolsey died of illness on his journey back to London, spared the spectacle of execution by mere chance. His vast palace at Hampton Court, once a glittering symbol of his wealth and pride, passed swiftly and permanently into Henry's possession. Having lost faith in Rome, Henry turned elsewhere. He sought theological opinions from universities across Europe, hoping scholars would support his claim that his marriage violated divine law. But the results were disappointing. Many academics sided with Catherine. The Pope remained unmoved. Time was slipping away, and Henry's need for a son pressed upon him like a tightening band of iron. It was in this rising desperation that new figures stepped forward, men whose influence would reshape not only Henry's court, but the entire religious landscape of England. Thomas Cromwell, once a loyal servant of Wolsey, had survived his master's fall with remarkable agility. Quiet, calculating, and fiercely intelligent, he soon earned the king's trust. With him came a new kind of political mind, one bold enough to dismantle old structures and build new ones in their place. Thomas Cranmer also entered the king's orbit. A scholar and theologian inclined toward reform, he possessed a mind comfortable with both scripture and innovation. And, of course, Anne Boleyn, whose presence now hovered over every political and religious conversation, was known to read reformist texts with interest. Her exact beliefs remain uncertain, but many at court viewed her as a potential ally to the evolving movement against Rome. Through these overlapping influences came the idea that would change everything. Cranmer proposed a radical solution. The King of England, anointed by God, was accountable only to God. Therefore, he should not need the Pope's permission to resolve matters of his own marriage. If Henry accepted this principle, he could declare himself the supreme authority over spiritual affairs in his realm, the supreme head of the Church in England. It was a breathtaking shift, one that rewrote centuries of religious tradition. But to Henry, it offered precisely what he needed: a clean path to annulment, a means to marry Anne, and a way to secure the male heir he believed fate owed him. It is important to note that Henry was not driven by Protestant conviction. He remained doctrinally Catholic, devoted to the Mass, the sacraments, and the ceremonial richness of Rome. His move away from papal authority was not born from theological agreement with Luther or reformist zeal. It was born from urgency, from obsession, and from a sense of kingly power that had grown more absolute with every passing year. The great matter, once a personal dilemma, had evolved into a political storm, and soon it would become a religious revolution, one that would sever England from Rome, reshape the monarchy, and bind Henry's legacy forever to a decision that began, quietly, with a single question. Was his marriage to Catherine ever lawful in the eyes of God? It took nearly 2 long years of exhausting struggle, pressuring bishops, confronting Parliament, and pushing against every pillar of England's traditional order before Henry achieved what he desired. By the year 1532, the king had finally forced the political and ecclesiastical establishment to acknowledge him as the supreme head of the Church in England. Payments normally sent to Rome were halted. Letters once addressed to the Pope grew cold, and the bond that had connected England to the papacy for centuries began to fray into silence. With this new authority secured, Henry moved swiftly. He appointed Thomas Cranmer as Archbishop of Canterbury, an office second only to the throne in spiritual weight, and placed in his hands the task Henry had been waiting more than 5 years to accomplish. In May of the year 1533, Cranmer convened an ecclesiastical court and declared Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon invalid from the beginning. The king was granted the annulment he craved, but in truth, Henry had already acted. Months earlier, on the 25th day of January, in the year 1533, he had secretly married Anne Boleyn. The ceremony was performed quietly, away from the public eye. It is possible Anne was already pregnant, though at the time they could not be certain. The secrecy, the haste, the restless urgency behind it all pointed to one truth: Henry could no longer wait. 8 months later, on the 7th day of September, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, named after Henry's late mother. Henry rejoiced, but beneath the celebration ran a thin, unmistakable line of disappointment. He had severed England from Rome, overthrown the consent of the Pope, defied the nobility, replaced his queen, and risked the stability of the kingdom, all in the hope of begetting a son. And yet, once more, a girl. He could not undo what he had done. And so, Henry tightened his grip. In the year 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, requiring all office holders to swear an oath recognising Henry as the sole supreme head of the Church of England and affirming his marriage to Anne as lawful. Refusal was not merely disobedience, it was treason. Many swore, some hesitated, a few resisted. Among those who refused was Sir Thomas More, Henry's longtime friend, learned counsellor, and author of Utopia. More had once praised Henry as a new Messiah, a saviour king worthy of admiration. But in the face of Henry's religious revolution, he withdrew from public life in quiet protest. His silence, however, was not enough. For Henry, silence was disloyalty. More was imprisoned in the Tower of London, interrogated, and eventually charged with treason not because he spoke against the king, but because he would not swear that Henry's spiritual authority surpassed the Pope's. The penalty for treason was brutally precise: hanging, disembowelment, and quartering. But Henry, invoking the warmth of past friendship, commuted the sentence to beheading. And so, on the 6th day of July, in the year 1535, Thomas More walked calmly to the scaffold. In his final breath, he declared that he died, the king's good servant, but God's first. His execution was a turning point. From that day on, every voice that challenged Henry's new order understood the price of defiance. The king had broken with Rome, and now he broke with anyone who stood in the way of his will. In that same year, Catherine of Aragon died of illness. Her passing should have cleared the path for Anne, removing the last living symbol of Henry's first marriage, and erasing the moral leverage Catherine still held in the hearts of the English people. But fate was already turning. Anne, once the dazzling new queen, the promise of renewal, the woman for whom Henry had torn apart church and kingdom, was beginning to lose her fragile hold on power. Her pregnancy losses, her quick temper, her difficulty adapting to the quiet politics required of a queen, all of it converged with Henry's simmering disappointment. The obstacles before Anne had vanished. Yet the shadow, growing behind her, was darker still. After Elizabeth's birth, Anne became pregnant twice more, but both pregnancies ended in miscarriage. With each loss, her position grew more fragile. Her role had changed completely. Once, she had been the unattainable woman who held the power to refuse the king. Now she was expected to be the soft, serene queen who produced a male heir on command. Yet Anne remained Anne, sharp-tongued, intelligent, quick to argue, quick to jealousy. These were the very traits that had once inflamed Henry's desire when she had been the woman he could not fully possess. But as queen, those same qualities irritated him. They clashed with what he needed her to be: silent, compliant, fertile. By the early months of the year 1536, Henry's patience had thinned. Anne suffered another miscarriage. At the same moment, Henry's attention drifted toward Jane Seymour, a quiet, compliant lady-in-waiting from an ambitious family, known for her piety and gentleness. Jane was everything Anne was not: modest where Anne was bold, serene where Anne was fiery, submissive where Anne pushed back. And crucially, Jane's family understood the currents of court politics and encouraged her to present herself as a contrast to the Queen. Around this time, accusations began to surface, first as whispers, then as official charges. Anne was accused of adultery with several men at court, including Mark Smeaton, a court musician, Henry Norris, a trusted gentleman of the Privy Chamber, William Brereton, and even her own brother, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford. Another charge claimed she had plotted the king's death. These allegations were sensational, grotesque, and staggeringly unlikely. But the machinery of interrogation had already been set in motion, and under pressure, frightened men said whatever their examiners needed to hear. The trials were a spectacle, hasty and merciless. Anne was denied the chance to confront witnesses. The verdict was predetermined. And so, on the 31st day of May, in the year 1536, Anne Boleyn ascended the scaffold at the Tower of London. Her final words were gentle, loyal, even blessing the king, asking God to protect him, and admitting only to pride and human failings, never to the crimes written against her. Henry did not wait even 24 hours to move on. The very next day, he became formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. Within weeks, Jane was queen. Jane and her family supported Henry's supremacy over the English church, yet she remained a devout Catholic. Many quietly hoped she would guide Henry back toward traditional Catholic worship, reversing some of the upheaval that the break with Rome had caused. But Henry had already tasted the wealth of the monasteries, and that taste had turned into appetite. Beginning in the year 1536, Henry ordered Thomas Cromwell to execute what became one of the most dramatic economic and religious transformations in English history: the dissolution of the monasteries. Roughly 800 religious houses across England and Wales, monasteries, priories, nunneries, friaries, were closed. Their lands were seized, their gold and silver plate melted down, their libraries scattered, their buildings sold or destroyed. Reformers justified the act by claiming widespread corruption and unbiblical practices among the monks. But another motive lay beneath. The immense wealth of these institutions could pay off royal debts and fund Henry's next war with France. The closures triggered a massive rebellion in the north, the Pilgrimage of Grace. Tens of thousands marched under banners marked with the 5 wounds of Christ, demanding the restoration of the monasteries, the return of traditional Catholic rites, and the removal of Cromwell and other evil counsellors. At first, Henry promised pardon, but when unrest continued, he unleashed brutal reprisals. Hundreds of leaders were executed, including men who believed they had been forgiven. Amid these national upheavals, Jane Seymour's fate took its own tragic course. In the year 1537, she gave Henry the one gift he had sought for decades: a healthy son, Prince Edward. Bells rang across England. Henry wept with joy, but the celebration was short-lived. Jane fell ill from postnatal complications and died less than 2 weeks after giving birth. Henry had finally secured the male heir he had torn kingdoms apart to obtain, but he paid for it with the life of the only wife he may ever have truly mourned. As the years advanced, the king grew richer, more powerful, and increasingly isolated. The wound in his leg, opened years earlier in a jousting accident, refused to heal, festered, and tormented him daily. His body swelled, his temper sharpened, and though England had changed irrevocably under his rule, Henry himself was slowly becoming a man defined as much by pain and loss as by triumph. After the death of Jane Seymour, Henry truly mourned. Those close to him noted that this grief was unlike anything he had shown for Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn. Yet the sadness of a king could not outweigh the needs of a kingdom. One prince, young Edward, was not enough to secure the fragile Tudor line. One fever, one fall from a horse, one sudden infection, and England could collapse back into the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. So when Henry slowly regained his strength, his counsellors began to whisper a familiar refrain: the king must marry again. The fourth marriage emerged, not from passion but from strategy. The bride was Anne of Cleves, sister of the Duke of Cleves, whose territories were aligned with the Schmalkaldic League, an alliance of Protestant principalities in the Holy Roman Empire. England, isolated after breaking with Rome, needed allies. Thomas Cromwell saw an opportunity and urged Henry toward a German-English alliance cemented through marriage. To ensure Henry approved of the match, Cromwell sent the renowned artist Hans Holbein the Younger to paint Anne's portrait. Holbein returned with an image of grace and dignity: serene expression, delicate features, fine attire. Henry was pleased, more than pleased. He felt assured. But when Anne arrived in England in the final days of the year, 1539, everything unravelled. Henry met her in disguise, hoping for a romantic first encounter. Instead, he recoiled. He stormed to Cromwell and raged, claiming, "I like her not." He complained that she had an unpleasant odour, that her figure displeased him, that her body did not seem maidenly. The irony was bitter. Henry himself, swollen to more than 300 pounds, tormented by a festering leg ulcer and worn down by age, found fault in her appearance. Yet politics forced his hand. On the 6th day of January, in the year 1540, Henry married Anne of Cleves. The marriage lasted less than 6 months. Henry demanded an annulment, citing that Anne had once been pre-contracted to Francis of Lorraine, a technicality he now seized upon as justification. Remarkably, Anne submitted with calm dignity. She accepted generous settlements, was granted palaces and income, and was given the title the King's Sister. She would become one of the very few women to walk away from Henry's orbit, with her head still firmly on her shoulders. Thomas Cromwell, however, was not so fortunate. Henry blamed him entirely for the ridiculous marriage. Enemies at court pounced. Cromwell was arrested, condemned, and on the 28th day of July, in the year 1540, he was executed. His fall was swift, brutal, and irreversible. That very same day, Henry married his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. Catherine was only 17, niece of the powerful and conservative Duke of Norfolk. She was everything Henry, now over 50, ill and volatile, yearned desperately to feel again: youth, sweetness, beauty, softness. In her presence, he felt invigorated, revived, almost reborn. Reality, however, was merciless. Henry's body was failing. His leg ulcer oozed and stank. He could barely walk without assistance. His weight made movement painful. His temper was unpredictable. Catherine found herself trapped in a marriage she had no power to refuse, a girl married to a man old enough to be her grandfather. She sought comfort elsewhere. Her relationship with Thomas Culpeper, a handsome gentleman of the Privy Chamber, became a dangerous secret. Meetings by night, letters exchanged. Meanwhile, investigations uncovered that Catherine had once been involved with Francis Dereham before her marriage to Henry, a discovery that, combined with her present actions, sealed her fate. By late in the year 1541, Catherine was arrested. Interrogations followed, confessions were extracted, accusations sharpened into charges. On the 13th day of February, in the year 1542, Catherine Howard, only 19 years old, was executed at the Tower of London. Those who witnessed her final moments said she trembled, yet spoke with clarity and acceptance. Henry was left drained, hollowed by betrayal, age, and illness. Yet the kingdom needed stability, and Henry needed companionship that would not unravel into scandal or revolt. His sixth and final marriage brought a different kind of woman into his life: Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr was 31, a twice-widowed noblewoman of intelligence, deep piety, and gentle firmness. She was not a beauty in the style of Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard, nor a political pawn like Anne of Cleves, nor a quiet ideal like Jane Seymour. But she possessed something Henry desperately needed: patience, steadiness, and an emotional maturity that matched the challenges of his final years. She cared for his failing health with grace. She navigated court factions with calm wisdom. She worked tirelessly to reconcile Henry with his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, eventually persuading him to restore both girls to the line of succession. Through Catherine Parr, the fractured Tudor family began, at last, to resemble something like unity, if only for a brief span in the twilight of Henry's turbulent life. Running parallel to the calamities of his marriages, Henry continued reshaping England with the power he had seized, fashioning a church and a kingdom that reflected not doctrine, but his will. He did not desire Roman Catholicism as it had existed for centuries, nor did he embrace the rising tide of continental Protestantism. Henry's vision was simpler and far more personal: a Catholic church with himself as pope. After the dissolution of the monasteries, wealth poured into the royal treasury with breathtaking speed. Gold chalices, silver reliquaries, illuminated manuscripts crafted over 1,000 years, acres upon acres of farmland. Everything was confiscated, sold, or granted to nobles Henry wished to reward. In the span of a few years, Henry transformed from a financially cautious king into one of the wealthiest monarchs in Europe. But that wealth came at a price. To the Catholic world, England had become a renegade state, a rebellious island that had shattered the unity of Christendom. To the Protestants on the continent, Henry appeared half-hearted, reluctant, unwilling to follow reform to its full theological conclusions. In their eyes, he was neither brother nor ally, but something muddled and suspicious. Hated by both sides, Henry fortified. Between the years 1536 and 1539, he ordered the construction of hundreds of coastal fortifications, from the Downs to the Solent, from Kent to Cornwall, transforming England into what contemporaries called an island fortress. Combined with the expanding navy he had built earlier, these defences formed the backbone of coastal security for centuries to come. Meanwhile, under the influence of Archbishop Cranmer and reform-minded clergy, England began to see the first tremors of new religious texts. In the year 1536, the 10 Articles were published, an early attempt at defining doctrine in a kingdom now positioned between Rome and Wittenberg. In the year 1537 came the first authorized English Bible, making scripture accessible to those who had never before held God's word in their own tongue. That same year also saw the release of the Bishop's Book, a theological guide aiming to clarify matters of faith for the unsettled English people. Yet in a move that bewildered allies and enemies alike, Henry suddenly reversed course. In the year 1539, he issued the 6 Articles, which restored nearly all traditional Catholic doctrines: transubstantiation, clerical celibacy, private masses, everything except papal supremacy. The penalties for rejecting these articles were severe, including death. Reformers fled the country. The kingdom shuddered under the sharp turn. Henry had made it clear he was not Protestant. Not then, not ever. He had used reform to break Rome, to seize monastic wealth, to free himself from Catherine and marry Anne. But once those goals were met, he retreated toward the familiar shape of the old church, only with himself enthroned at the top. As age crept over him, Henry marched once more into war. From the year 1544 to 1546, he launched his 3rd major campaign against France. Powered by the enormous wealth taken from the monasteries, much of which was now nearly spent, he raised armies, shipped supplies across the Channel, and finally seized the port city of Boulogne. It was a victory he celebrated with pride, but it was a hollow triumph, costing sums so vast that even the swollen Tudor treasury could barely withstand the blow. It was the most expensive success of Henry's life. At the same time, he turned his gaze northward. Determined to force Scotland into an alliance, he demanded that the infant Mary, Queen of Scots, be betrothed to his son Edward. When Scotland refused, Henry unleashed a series of brutal campaigns known as the Rough Wooing: raids, burnings, and battles meant to terrorize the Scots into submission. The effort failed. Like so many of Henry's endeavors in his final decade, the rough wooing produced devastation, not results. Scotland did not yield Mary. France stepped in to support her, and the conflict only deepened the isolation in which Henry had trapped his kingdom. By the mid-1540s, England was richer than ever and poorer than ever, its lands swollen with former monastic estates, its treasury drained by ceaseless war. Its church was Catholic, but not Catholic, Protestant, but not Protestant, loyal only to Henry's fluctuating commands. In these final years, the king, who once embodied youth, beauty, intellect, and promise, had transformed into something heavier physically, politically, spiritually. His kingdom carried the marks of his will: fortresses along its shores, a church shaped in his image, a treasury emptied by his campaigns, and a legacy that grew darker with every passing winter. Henry VIII, in his youth, had once embodied power itself, tall, broad-shouldered, radiant with vitality. He hunted tirelessly, jousted fearlessly, composed music, danced, and moved with a confidence that made foreign ambassadors describe him as the handsomest prince in Christendom. But everything changed after the accident on the 24th day of January, in the year 1536. During a joust, his armoured horse toppled and crashed onto him, pinning him beneath its weight. Henry lay unconscious for hours. When he finally woke, something fundamental within him had shifted. The fall reopened an old leg wound that had plagued him years earlier. This time, however, the injury never healed. Instead, it deepened into a chronic ulcer, raw, infected, agonizing. The medicine of the 16th century offered little mercy. Physicians believed that infection must drain out, so they kept the wound open, probing it with knives and heated metal rods to encourage discharge. The treatments only worsened the damage. With no anesthetics, no antibiotics, each dressing change was a fresh torture. The smell followed him everywhere, pungent, sour, impossible to mask. Unable to exercise, Henry began gaining weight at an alarming pace. Pain made him irritable, immobility made him swollen, frustration made him cruel. By the final decade of his reign, he was so heavy, well over 300 pounds, that special mechanical devices had to be built to move him around the palace. He still appeared at ceremonies, but needed ramps, winches, and attendants to lift him onto his throne. The magnificent youth who had dazzled Europe was gone. In his place stood a man altered by pain, fear, and age. From the year 1543 onward, Catherine Parr, his 6th and final wife, worked constantly to bring calm back into Henry's collapsing world. She was intelligent, devout, diplomatic, and unusually steady. With patience and persistence, she helped reconcile the king with his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, eventually persuading him to restore both girls to the line of succession. She debated theology with him, supported religious learning, and encouraged him to read scriptures for comfort. Yet Catherine walked on dangerous ground. Reformist in her leanings, she attracted suspicion from the conservative faction at court. At one point, they nearly convinced Henry that she held heretical views. For a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed Catherine might follow Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard to the scaffold. But the danger passed. Henry, whether out of affection, respect, or weariness, protected her. With Catherine Parr, his household finally gained a measure of peace. But peace could not slow the damage within Henry's body. By late in the year 1546, his health collapsed rapidly. He withdrew from court life, living mostly within the palace of Whitehall, attended by physicians who dared not speak honestly about his condition. To declare the king near death was treason. To predict it was to risk the axe. So they murmured reassurances, avoided direct answers, and hovered helplessly as Henry's strength faded. In his final weeks, he oversaw revisions to his will, careful arrangements meant to secure the succession of Prince Edward and prevent new civil war. But he could no longer govern directly. Fever, infection, and exhaustion pressed down upon him. His leg ulcer worsened. He slept fitfully. He frequently drifted between lucidity and confusion. Those who visited him saw only the shadow of a man who had once commanded armies, broken empires, and reshaped the faith of an entire nation. Late on the night of the 27th day of January, in the year 1547, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the same man who had guided him through England's break with Rome, was summoned to the king's bedside. Cranmer arrived to find Henry speechless, barely conscious. The archbishop urged him to give a final confession, but Henry could not speak. Instead, he tightened his grip around Cranmer's hand, signalling as best he could that he still trusted in God. In the early hours of the 28th day of January, at the age of 55, Henry VIII died. The breath left his body quietly, an ending oddly gentle for a man whose life had been a storm. And so the curtain fell on one of Europe's most formidable figures, a king who carved his will upon the world with both brilliance and brutality. He left behind a transformed England, richer, harsher, wounded, and forever changed, shaped by a man who had been, at different times, its brightest light and its deepest shadow. The moment Henry closed his eyes for the last time, the crown passed to his only legitimate son, Edward VI, the frail boy born of Jane Seymour. He was just 9 years old, bright, observant, studious, but physically delicate and far too young to rule. Real power fell immediately into the hands of two men. First came his maternal uncle, Edward Seymour, who styled himself Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector of the realm. After Somerset's fall, authority shifted to John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, cunning, pragmatic, and deeply entangled with the Protestant faction at court. Edward's reign was short, but its impact was immense. Unlike his father, who had used religion as a tool for personal aims, Edward was a sincere Protestant. He had been raised in a carefully crafted circle of reformers, learned tutors, evangelical ministers, humanist scholars, and political allies who saw in the young king an opportunity to reshape England according to the principles of the Reformation. Edward believed fervently in these ideas, and under the guidance of his council, the kingdom underwent the most dramatic and sweeping religious transformation in its history. In just 6 years, the fabric of English worship was unmade. Churches were stripped of their images and relics, statues removed, altars dismantled, stained glass shattered or whitewashed. Gold and silver ornaments that had survived Henry's earlier seizures were now confiscated by order of the crown. The English Bible, first authorized in the year 1537, was pushed into every parish, ensuring that scripture in the vernacular became the heart of religious life. Even more monumental was the work of Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop Henry had once elevated. Under Edward, freed from the king's unpredictable swings between reform and conservatism, Cranmer finally carried out the vision he had long nurtured. He published the Book of Common Prayer, the first edition in the year 1549, and a more explicitly Protestant second edition in the year 1552. This book replaced the Latin Mass with a distinctly English liturgy, transforming not just doctrine, but the sounds, rhythms, and rituals of everyday devotion. Communion replaced the sacrificial Mass. Clerical marriage was permitted. The traditional Catholic understanding of the Eucharist was dismantled. By the early 1550s, England had become, unmistakably, a Protestant nation, something Henry had never intended. But the boy at the centre of this revolution was fading. Edward had always been sickly. He suffered from chronic respiratory illnesses, and by the beginning of the year 1553, he was dying, likely of tuberculosis, complicated by pneumonia. The council was desperate. If Edward died, the next in line was Mary, Henry's elder daughter, by Catherine of Aragon, a devout Catholic determined to reverse the Reformation. For the Protestant regime, Mary's accession meant ruin. In the fevered final months of Edward's life, John Dudley and his allies crafted a plan. They pressured the young king into signing a document titled My Devise for the Succession, which bypassed both Mary and Elizabeth. Instead, it named Lady Jane Grey, the teenaged granddaughter of Henry VII's daughter, Mary Tudor, as the rightful heir. Jane was brilliant, well-educated, deeply Protestant, and conveniently married to Dudley's own son, Guildford. When Edward died on the 6th day of July, in the year 1553, Jane was proclaimed queen. Her reign lasted 13 days. Across England, the people rose not for Protestantism or Catholicism, but for legitimacy. Whatever their beliefs, they knew who Henry's eldest surviving child was. Mary Tudor's bloodline was clear, her claim undeniable, her identity familiar. She was the child of a queen many had loved, the rightful heir by law and tradition. Mary gathered supporters rapidly. Nobles defected. Towns declared for her. Jane's council collapsed. On the 19th day of July, Mary entered London to thunderous cheers. Jane, who had never wanted the crown, who had been thrust into the role by others, was imprisoned in the Tower. The following year, she was executed, a casualty of a struggle she had not chosen. In the year 1553, Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, ascended the throne of England, and with her rise, the wheel of history turned once more back toward Rome, back toward the faith of her mother, and toward a chapter history would remember under a darker name. When Mary I was crowned at Westminster Abbey, a strange, almost bitter question echoed through the kingdom. After everything Henry VIII had done, breaking from Rome, shattering the ancient church, executing advisers, discarding wives, plunging England into religious turmoil for what? In the end, the child of Catherine of Aragon, the very woman Henry spent nearly 10 years trying to cast aside, ascended the throne exactly as if none of his battles had changed destiny at all. But the irony ran deeper still. Mary reigned only 5 years. She died in the year 1558, without a child to inherit the crown. And who succeeded her? Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman Henry had condemned to death. The daughter he had declared illegitimate. The child he had once tried to exclude from succession entirely. Yet it was Elizabeth who fulfilled everything Henry had tried and failed to achieve. Elizabeth I ruled for 44 years. During her reign, England entered its golden age. Trade expanded, exploration flourished, the arts bloomed, and the kingdom emerged as a rising European power. Most important of all, she stabilized the religious landscape Henry had left fractured. Where her half-brother Edward pushed England deep into radical Protestantism, and her half-sister Mary violently attempted to restore Roman Catholicism, Elizabeth charted a course both firm and balanced. She created a church that was neither fully Catholic nor fully Protestant, something distinctly English, shaped by her own steady pragmatism. It was exactly the middle ground Henry had tried to construct, but had never truly understood. Under Elizabeth's rule, the Church of England solidified into a national institution, moderate, adaptable, and deeply tied to English identity. It became, in a sense, the version of Henry's religious dream that he himself could never articulate. And with that stability came unity, confidence, and the foundations of the empire that would grow in later centuries. So in the end, Henry's true legacy did not come from the places he poured his energy, not from the wars he waged at immense cost, not from the treasure he seized and squandered, not from the endless cycle of marriages, divorces, accusations, and executions. Instead, his legacy emerged from 3 strange, unexpected fragments. First, the break with Rome, an act he pursued not from spiritual conviction, but from personal need, became the cornerstone of England's future independence. Second, the existence of a distinct English church, one he shaped only imperfectly ensured that England would never again be spiritually ruled by a foreign power. And third, the daughters he never wanted, The daughters he considered political burdens became the rulers who healed the wounds he left behind. Mary, flawed but determined, proved that a woman could sit on England's throne by right, not by accident. Elizabeth proved that a woman could reign well with intelligence, longevity, and vision. These two queens, descended from the two women Henry rejected most violently, revealed a truth Henry had never been able to accept. England did not need a male heir to survive. England did not need a son to flourish. England, against all his expectations, thrived because of the daughters he had underestimated. So what then was Henry VIII? A tyrant? A visionary? A victim of pressure he was never ready to bear? A king trapped inside the shadow of his father? A man devoured by fear, desire, pride, and pain? Perhaps he was all of these. A figure vast and contradictory, capable of great glory and great ruin. A king who tore down more than he built, yet left behind a nation that was, in the long arc of history, stronger because of his chaos, not despite it. And that is the deepest paradox of Henry VIII. He broke everything he touched, and yet, somehow, the England that rose from those broken pieces was steadier, richer, and more powerful than the one he inherited. A king who destroyed to create, who wounded to strengthen, who failed in nearly every personal ambition, but succeeded, unknowingly, in shaping the destiny of an empire. A man impossible to ignore, a man impossible to simplify, a man whose shadow still stretches wide, dark, unforgettable across the history of England.